The Biden administration has set out to deploy more than 500,000 EV charging stations by the end of this decade. It's part of a larger ambition to slash the number of all gas-powered cars in the U.S. by half by 2030. Making that transition equitable, though, could be a challenge with the majority of charging stations deployed in predominantly white neighborhoods. And our next guest is trying to change that through a unique incubator in Los Angeles. Let's bring in Matt Petersen. He is the CEO of LA Cleantech Incubator, the segment presented by BMW. Matt, good to talk to you again. You know, it's interesting. In preparing for this, I was looking at a map of where all the charging stations are right now. And it's really glaring to see how concentrated they are in sort of predominantly, wealthy, white neighborhoods. I mean, can you talk about what the landscape looks like in LA, where we have seen significant transition to EVs?
Yeah, well, great to see you, Akiko. Thanks for having me on. When we look at new markets and emerging markets, obviously the signals from policymakers in California really put the investment into electric vehicles and the charging infrastructure that makes it possible. Now, what that means is that the early adopters have predominantly been on what we call the west side of Los Angeles, in our case, which is predominantly white. And what we are doing as an organization through our Transportation Electrification Partnership is seeing how we can accelerate investment into low-income disadvantaged communities, meaning those communities that have socioeconomic challenges, disinvestment, redlining, historical and institutional barriers to really getting access to the services they need, whether it's adequate transit or transportation, let alone electric vehicles. So by doing pilots and advocating for policies like we successfully advocated for a statewide zero emissions vehicle advocate for disadvantaged communities, or equity advocate, as we called it. Now the governor's going to appoint that person for California to help address some of these inequities. But in the meantime, we're working on putting charging and EV car sharing into places like public housing, where we know populations, people that live there don't have access to adequate transportation, suffer from worse air quality, and really can benefit from these kinds of solutions right there, available exclusively for them.
Matt, can you talk a bit more about the structure of LACI? I mean, it's interesting to see how you're sort of playing this from both sides. You're obviously investing in some of these startups that are addressing those very issues you talked about, but you're also deploying these charging stations into more low-income communities and exposing them to them so that there's not as big of a divide in terms of going from a gas-powered car to an EV.
Yeah, I think we're helping entrepreneurs on one end, particularly Black, brown, and female entrepreneurs who have a tougher time getting access to capital. So how do we provide them additional resources and support to get access to capital, including from our own venture fund and, debt fund that we provide low-cost financing to them for capital access and working capital. But at the same time, how do we work with local governments and city officials to bring the charging where it needs to go? So our utility partners like Edison and LADWP are making programs available to invest in chargers in lower income neighborhoods. But how do we accelerate that? So we're doing a pilot in a community known as Huntington Gardens that's going to be a fast charger at the street near multifamily buildings, a predominantly low income neighborhood, so that we can then educate people about electric vehicles, make public charging available to them, and demonstrate where it is. And how do we also target people that drive Uber and Lyft? How do we get TNC drivers behind the wheel of an EV? And that kind of public fast charging is going to be critical. While we then work to get level 2 charging, the slower charging, inside of multifamily apartment buildings, so as people can take advantage of the used EV tax credit and the Inflation Reduction Act to buy more affordable EVs, that they have a place to charge.
Finally, Matt, California has kind of been on the front lines of this transition to go all electric. You've been working very closely with the mayor, Garcetti, there on the ground in shaping LA's policy. Now that you see where the federal government in this administration is trying to take it, I wonder if there are any lessons learned from California/LA's transition, if you think is a glaring missing piece when you look at federal policy to address this issue.
Well, not every state has a utility pursuing aggressive targets based on public policy or their own utility's commitment to the market for electric vehicles and the charging needed. Not every state has the rebates and additional incentives that California has. So how does the federal government go in and provide support directly to cities as much as they can? So through the competitive grant program, through the bipartisan infrastructure package, some cities will be able to access those dollars for charging directly. Their state energy offices may not be as interested in deploying those charging stations with funding from the federal government equitably into lower income neighborhoods so that people can access the benefits of electric vehicles by having the charging infrastructure in their backyard. The other thing is making sure that those chargers are working. If you drive an EV, sometimes you may experience a charger that doesn't work. And 80% of the time that it does not, it's a non-electrical issue. It means that the Wi-Fi connection's down, something like a software issue. So we have a company that we've incubated called Charger Help that's out there making sure we have uptime. So the federal government can make sure those that benefit from the federal government dollars, make sure those chargers are working 95% of the time. And that there's a company like Charger Help making sure those chargers are working, diagnose them, fix them, keep them up and maintained.
Yeah, it's certainly been great to watch the progress of everything you've done over at LACI. Matt, good to talk to you today. Matt Petersen, CEO of LACI.